How are you? Let's see. Good job. It makes you look even more.
Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for being here. As you know, we're getting ready for the State of the State address, which is next week, which really lays out the policy vision and priorities for the coming year. There are a number of issues that are going to be addressed in the State of the State. Yesterday we spoke about the issue of education and the work of the Education Commission, which was bold and provocative, and we're going to be working on that over the next few days for inclusion in the State of the State. And one of the other areas that is going to be addressed in the State of the State are the lessons learned, lessons that should be learned from Hurricane Sandy, and before that, Hurricane Irene and Storm Lee and the nor'easters that we've been hit. But we've come to the conclusion that these are not episodic situations. There is a pattern. We believe there's going to be a recurrence. And once you come to that understanding or realization, then you say, well, how do we get ready? And how do we learn from these situations? And how do we prepare? How do we reduce the damage in the future? And that is a very big question and a very big undertaking. And it's a very broad undertaking. It goes from the short-term, immediate measures to long-term measures. It has operational questions. How do we have the best emergency response operation? For those of us, like the people in this room, who actually have been out there in the middle of these storms, and you've seen how dangerous the situation is, you see how chaotic that it can quickly become, how hard it is to do the coordination, how you literally see society raveling right before your eyes. So the operational issues, short-term issues, construction issues, long-term design issues, the whole array. We put together several commissions that were studying just that. They'll now be reporting. So again, like the Education Commission, we can go through the reports, we can be briefed thoroughly, and then make some decisions, and we'll announce those decisions in the State of the State. We have guests who are with us today who've done a lot of good work, who are going to report. I want to thank them very much for their work. I'll have comments after their briefing. And with that, let me turn it over to Larry Schwartz, Secretary to the Governor.
Thank you, Governor. Over the past 2 years, New York has been hit by some of the most destructive natural disasters in our state's history. We have lost lives, we've lost homes, businesses, and property. In the wake of Hurricane Sandy, Governor Cuomo took bold steps to ensure that New York becomes one of the most prepared states in our country. He created 4 commissions: New York State Ready, New York State Respond, New York State 2100, and the Moreland Commission on Utility Storm Preparation and Response, all tasked with examining our existing emergency response systems and making recommendations on how to improve it. Today, we will hear from the first 2 commissions, New York State Ready and New York State Respond, which Emergency Services Commissioner Jerry Howell will introduce in just a minute. New York State 2100 was tasked with reviewing longer-term infrastructure needs to help our state and cities adapt to the new normal of extreme weather conditions. The Moreland Commission was tasked to undertake a thorough review of all actions taken by our utility companies before and after emergencies such as Hurricane Sandy. The Moreland Commission will also make specific recommendations on how to reform and modernize oversight, regulation, and management of New York's power delivery services. We will be hearing more from New York State 2100 and the Moreland Commission in the near future. The Ready Commission and Respond Commission will propose actionable reforms and will bring our emergency preparedness and response capabilities into the 21st century to ensure greater public safety and public health of all New Yorkers. With that, let me now ask Commissioner Howard introduce our presenters for today.
Thanks, Larry. It's my pleasure today to introduce the co-chairs of the commissions. With us today are Ira Milstein, Dr. Erwin Redliner, co-chairs of the New York State Ready Commission, and Admiral Thad Allen and Brad Penuel, co-chairs of the New York State Respond Commission. Superstorm Sandy presented one of the greatest operational challenges that the state has ever seen. The storm caused enormous damage, unlike we've ever seen in the state before. To date, we've removed and expect to remove, by the time we're done, close to 6 million cubic yards of debris. We had over 2 million people without power. We had 400,000 evacuations. Many of those people are still in temporary housing or in rental housing. We had thousands of housing units destroyed or damaged. And the shutdown of the transit system, which was done in an extremely orderly fashion when the governor ordered the system shut down, impacted the 8 million people that use it every day. The agencies that were involved, including the Red Cross, Catholic Charities, and certainly the Department of Military Naval Affairs under General Murphy, served over 1 million meals, and we're still serving them as we speak. This required mobilization of literally thousands of emergency responders from around the state and from around the country. We had 27 different states represented here in New York with personnel that came through various mutual aid agreements. The National Guard and citizen volunteers were all involved. As Larry said, Governor Cuomo convened 4 commissions to ensure that New York learns from both Sandy and Irene and other recent severe events, so that we're even more prepared for these types of events in the future, which, as he just mentioned, we expect to occur with greater frequency. Today, we will hear some very thoughtful and actionable recommendations from the co-chairs of the 2 commissions, both New York State Ready and New York State Respond. The New York State Ready Commission, chaired, as I mentioned, by Dr. Redliner and Ira Milstein, was tasked with finding ways to prepare our networks, systems, and structures to withstand these major weather events. The New York Respond Commission, chaired by Admiral Allen and Brad Penuel, was tasked with finding ways to ensure the ability and capacity to effectively respond when disasters strike. It's my pleasure to now introduce Ira Milstein. Ira?
Thank you very much, Jerry. I think the slide speaks for itself, Governor. What we're interested in doing is presenting first and foremost a theme that's going to run through everybody's presentation. That goes for the Ready Commission as well as the Response Commission. We all feel there needs to be integration and coordination through a statewide network. It's very, very important that we, if I could skip to the last bullet, that we have a greater operating authority for the state to coordinate local decisions in an emergency to protect public health and safety. We never had anything like this before, but we're certain it's going to happen again one way or another. And integration and coordination of everything that has to happen is very important if we're going to prevent this or any of our work is going to be done. Through the day, you'll hear many, many suggestions by each of us with respect to very specific things that need to be done, both short and long term. But when you think about the numbers of people who are involved in responding and preparing, it's innumerable. You have state agencies, you have many, many parties, you have local governments, you have the state itself, you have federal, you have private organizations, you have not-for-profits, you have faith-based organizations. All of these people and organizations are involved in presenting preparation and response. And how to bring them all together is, we think, the primary job of the state. I'm sure you agree with that. And the question is, how do we do that better than we have done before? We did well. Many people, all good faith and sometimes heroic, coordinated themselves to bring together, and the state was very much in helping do that. But now we think we need a more formal unification of responsibilities for planning to prepare and respond. It just has to be more formal, and we think that it's an essential part of what needs to be done going down the road. Admittedly, Governor, this isn't something that's going to happen overnight, but in preparing for it and in listening to all the recommendations, think about all these recommendations and how they're going to be brought together and how all the people who have to implement them have to be brought together in order to make it happen. It isn't going to be magic. It's going to require a lot of hard work, and there's only one place that it can happen. It's in the state. And the state is responsible, and the state should be given all the powers necessary to bring it about. And that's the basic theme which is going to run through the whole day as you begin to think about it. So thank you, Governor. It's been a pleasure to serve with my confreres here and all the people who were on the commission. By the way, our commissioners themselves were incredible. In a very short period of time, we had a plethora of excellent responses. Whoever put this together did it brilliantly. We had good people, and they all responded. And of course, your staff was terrific. So I thank you.
Thank you. And thanks, Governor. Also, just to reiterate what Ira just said, that we're very impressed with the support that the commission's got from you and your offices. It's just been amazing. And the other thing that's amazing was the quality of the response to the disaster by your state officials. It was very impressive. And having been personally, unfortunately, at many disasters in our country over the last 20 years, I must say that the response of New York State, its offices, its officials, its responders was spectacular. So on behalf of, I guess, everybody in our state, we just really want to thank everybody involved here. It was tremendous. I mean, there's always things that we can learn, and part of the commission's job is to try to figure out what we can get out of the experience that we had to make our response even better. Part of that has to do with building resiliency. This is absolutely key. This has to do with understanding the root causes of the disasters, where we can prevent, where we can mitigate, and where we can make more resilient. So the recommendations that we're going to make that are specific, and more to come in the next few weeks, but we wanted to highlight some of the specifics here to give you a sense of where we're going and what we think needs to be done. So we're going to start off with the issue of building in the state. And this especially pertains to building going forward. We really want to make sure that the building codes in New York State meet the needs of making the state more resilient. And that resiliency is not just a generic term. It actually comes down to very specific details of how buildings are constructed, what are the factors that have to go into the actual construction, the infrastructure, and what are the codes, what should the codes contain, how should they be presented, so that at the end of the day we build things better and stronger than we ever have before. And dealing with those regulations will be extremely important here. I think you'll see that we're going to be covering issues even like the infrastructure for power backup. We had issues in the hospitals. We think those can be addressed by upgrading the level of intensity, which we're focused on how to make the backup systems as reliable as possible so that we can depend on the backup power and the other things that need to be in these buildings. So the building regulations, I think, are extremely important, will be important for New York's resiliency going forward. The next couple of points have to do with something that is near and dear to us, and I know to you, which has to do with how is New York going to protect its citizens, and especially its most vulnerable citizens? Because on some level, we're going to be judged by how well we've taken care of our frail elderly, our children, and everybody that will need the support of effective government. And your commitment to that has driven us to make some very specific recommendations in this area. And starting off with the location of the structures that are taking care, the facilities that are taking care of people, whether it's hospitals or nursing homes or whatever it might be. These buildings and where they're placed have to be obviously where they're needed, but then they also have to be built very specifically to be able to address any potential weather-related threats or other kinds of disaster threats. So there's a series of recommendations that will address this specific challenge of making sure that those very vital facilities are located properly. We also think that there is probably more that we can do in terms of specifically identifying populations that are particularly vulnerable. As I mentioned, frail elderly people who have chronic medical conditions, children, and so forth. And we'd like to be able to know where those people are to the extent possible before the disaster, so we're able to make sure they're getting the services they need during and after the disaster impact, so that we can protect them and make sure that they know that your government is here for them, and that's the point of this series of recommendations. And the other two that I want to point out, and again, this is just part of what's going to be a large array of things to absorb, but I think things that are immediate here and were apparent during Sandy have to do with things like the access to fuel, which you're well aware of. And to that point, we think that there should be requirements that gas stations, for instance, that are in locations that might be vulnerable to a disaster, that they have very explicit rules and regulations about how to make sure that they have the backup power needed, so if there are problems with the grid, they are still able to function as gas stations, providing fuel for citizens and for essential functions. And the second recommendation with respect to this has to do with the development of a robust strategic fuel supply and reserve capacity to make sure that the state and the citizens of the state have enough backup fuel so that we can make sure that people have it when they need it. And we think this is also going to be a critical element of what needs to happen going forward. But again, thank you very much for our ability to help you think of what needs to be done. We'll look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you, Doctor.
Morning, Governor. On behalf of my co-chair, Brad Pinuel from New York University, and the members of the commission, I want to thank the staff for the support we got. I want to echo the comments that have been made so far. We really thank the people that have supported us. In looking at these responses, there are a couple of characteristics that really jump out at you, and this goes without saying. One of them is scale. You know, all of a sudden the requirements that are put on systems completely go well beyond what was envisioned in the planning for day-to-day operations. The second one is trying to create access so you can get in and do what you need to do. So in looking at the larger report, which you will get, we thought we'd pull out a couple of items we thought are very key for you to consider going forward. The first one is how you employ the National Guard. They're a great asset. I've had a great conversation with General Murphy, great leader in your staff here. They can do a lot of things for you, and our recommendation is to make them more applicable to these disasters by increasing their training and what they can do in these responses, particularly as it relates to power restoration, water resources, heavy rescue equipment operation, and those types of things. The ability to put them in right away actually empowers you to do things like restore power and the other emergency services that need to happen, because access and debris removal paces almost everything that happens, and I think there's a great role there for the National Guard to be played, and I think looking at that going forward will serve the state very well. When you look to your civilian population, you have a lot of people out there that have passion, resources, and commitment and want to get involved. You also have people that are very knowledgeable in the trades, and we know how valuable electricians and plumbers and carpenters become after these events. So I think the two things we're looking at there is a way to create some kind of a core of the people that are in skilled trades to bring them to bear as quickly as possible following these events. And the second one is how to actually use volunteers. There are people who don't have specific skills, but they have, again, passion, resources, and commitment, and a way to actually enroll them into the system and get them out there where they can be part of it. Not only increases the scale of the response, but also allows you to get people that want to be involved in the community. And I think it's a very strong signal to send moving forward. So, and how you actually scale up and use people, those are the two strong recommendations we would make. The second issue is equipment and supplies. And you never have enough of what you need when one of these things occurs. And so I think some real thoughtful planning into what needs to be stockpiled. Taking a look at some of these things have shelf life and everything else. But I think there are improvements that can be made exactly what it is you need to have, where it needs to be, and how you bring that to the folks that need it when you need it most. And the other issue is how you actually get it there. And I think this is where the private sector can play a key role for you, Governor. These are the people that are experts in logistics, transportation, storage, distribution, and then the types of materials you need. There are people that do this in the private sector every day. And we think bringing those folks into the response structure can add immense value, but also can knit the community in with the private sector and bring them in, because nobody does anything alone in this country anymore, and the private sector plays a huge role moving forward. So we would recommend a major role for the private sector in emergency response planning and actually bringing them into the command structure. And it's been my pleasure to serve. Thank you, Governor.
Thank you, Mr. Allen.
Governor, I echo Admiral Allen's comments. It's been a pleasure to serve on this commission. I'd just like to offer a couple of thoughts. Technology has emerged around us, and there are ways from the state's perspective that we could harness some of this technology. It's compelling from the state's perspective because this could be done relatively quickly, hopefully before next hurricane season. One of those tools, probably most of us in this room use texting on a daily basis. There are ways the state could harness this and create a New York text, for example, that could send geographically pinpointed information to those in affected areas after an event. This would be an immensely valuable tool and one that could be put in place rapidly. Another is a way most of us in our, when we consume things, from goods to airline tickets to other things, you go on the internet. You have a portal. Recommendations that came up were to create a disaster response portal that could aggregate information, everything from financial and response information that people in those affected areas need. They could go and get information on how to access FEMA, access state resources and others. You could also have on this portal preparedness information, which would be invaluable for people to have. It could also play a vital role coordinating responses on the ground from all of the various organizations, from the formal state agencies to volunteer nonprofit groups. And a portal like this could be set up rapidly. So just ways to acknowledge that technology has emerged around us in ways that we could apply that would alleviate suffering in the days and moments after an event. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me make a couple of points, if I might, and then the floor will be open. Ready versus respond. On the respond, within the respond portfolio, if you will, the delineation of short-term and long-term, there's, those of you who've worked with me before, I'm a very sort of linear, practical person and goal-oriented person. What can we get done now versus what's going to be more complicated, funding questions, redesign questions, that is more of a long-term agenda. And I want to make sure that we separate those two. Protocols we can put in place now. Sort of lesson learned, priorities, evacuation priorities, et cetera, that we can put in place now. Code changes are going to be consultative. That's going to take a little bit of a longer period of time. So as the commission goes forward, that short-term versus long-term delineation is important to me. And over the next few days, especially the short-term agenda, I want to include in the state of the state, just so we can start that right away. On the readiness responsibility, there is probably no clearer a role for government and a responsibility for government than in the response in the middle of a crisis. I mean, it gets very simple and it gets very black and white. You know, people are in desperate need for help and assistance. It's a matter of life and death, literally. And the only organization, the only people who can help are government people. It's just the nature of the circumstances at that time in that moment. And the polarity of the situation, it either works or it doesn't work. People either show up or they don't show up. Either they have the right equipment or they don't have the right equipment. And if they don't show up and they don't have the right equipment, somebody's going to die. I mean, it is that, I don't want to be overly dramatic, but it is that stark a situation. And that has been imprinted in me on a visceral level. We chatted about when I was in the federal government, HUD, I was at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which had a disaster response responsibility. We did it all across the country. We did it all across the globe, actually. We were so good at it federally that we were dispatched to other countries to help them with disaster response. And then in the past 2 years alone as governor, I've gone through it 2 or 3 times. And it's indescribable, the responsibility you feel when you're in the midst of that. So it is of paramount importance to us. And I pray that a situation that we went through never happens again, but I'm planning that it will happen again, and I want to be ready. And I want to be more ready than we've been in the past, because this whole area to me, I was chatting with my father over the holidays. He came up. My father was governor from 1982 to 94. And we were trying to remember the last time in those 12 years that you had gone through something like a Sandy, et cetera. And there really was no analogy. This is a recent phenomenon. This whole disaster network was set up at a different time for a different set of issues. And the primacy of the local officials, because these were basically small, locally managed disasters. Creek rose up, 6 homes, you know. We never anticipated the scale of the disasters that we're now dealing with. So the operating protocols, the training, that is all very important to me. The state's emergency response, the agency that Commissioner Hauer oversees, is relatively tiny compared to most response networks. So how this works between the feds and the state and the locals, the training, so people met each other before that day. You know, this is not the time to be introducing yourself. How are you? I'm Andrew. You know, that they work together. People know that day how it's supposed to happen, who's in charge, what the triggers are, what the protocols are. I would invest in personnel, I would invest in training, and I would invest in establishing uniform protocols. I also believe the National Guard, General Murphy was outstanding, but that National Guard was probably our prime asset in response everywhere. And everyone will say that, by the way. From the largest local government to the smallest local government, they will all say, thank God that we had the National Guard with us. Training them to be in a capacity where they could offer more assistance, I think is also a brilliant idea, frankly, and something that I would be interested in investing in. And then, as you said, the supplies, you know, it was, I don't want to tell you the chaos we went through of trying to find, you know, it's hard to go find 10,000 generators, you know, on a Wednesday. So the supplies and the stockpiling, I think, is critically important and something that I know we need to do better than we've done it before. And the citizen establishing that citizen corps, I think that is a great idea. During Sandy, we were begging for electricians who could help hook up generators, once we found them, to get the gas out of the tanks in the gasoline stations. So we're literally, who knows electricians, and where's the association of electricians, and how do you find them when the power is down so they're not answering the phone? That whole citizen core. And I don't know if it's particular to this state. I think it might be, or I might want to think that it is, but our people want to help. They came from all over the state to respond. They showed up in Sandy. People from upstate visited downstate to help with Sandy. During Storm Irene, people from downstate went to the upstate, which is what was hurt by Irene. So I know there's a great potential among the citizenship to be involved and want to help. To have that organized before could be a great resource, because a lot of this is just, as you know better than I, you just need hands and bodies. And having that core set up where you can hit a button and word goes out, and there are people who are ready and trained and know the protocols, that would be, I think that could be a great asset for us. Anyway, great work so far. Think about that going forward, because as I said, there is no single function that is more important. We talked about education yesterday. That's probably long-term the most important thing that we do, education, economic development. On a individual activity level, there is nothing more important than this state emergency function, because it literally will be a matter of life and death. So thank you very much for it. Questions, comments? Commissioner DeStito?
Thank you. Thank you for your recommendations, and certainly coming from the operations of the state of New York with Office of General Services, your recommendation for stockpiling equipment and stuff, but you made a lot of recommendations, and I guess following up on what the governor's statement just was, what time frame would you say, and how would you prioritize the recommendations that you all made? You know, is one bigger than the other? The governor talked about, and I personally are concerned about vulnerable populations. When I was in the legislature, I did a piece of legislation that talked about identifying vulnerable populations. So can you give us an idea of what we need to do first and foremost?
And by the way, there's some things that need to be set in motion that, in terms of the issues about preventing certain disasters, mitigating resiliency, there's things that just get set in motion, and they're going to take a long time to actually get implemented. But as the governor is saying, and I completely agree with this, the ability to respond rapidly and effectively, there's really three things that have to be done. One has to do with things, with supplies. Do we have them pre-positioned? Do we have enough of them? Are we anticipating properly? Are they located in the right places, and so forth? The second thing has to do with people. And by the way, it's not, and this issue of training and exercising so people get to know each other is critically important, but people have to be trained. This goes for emergency responders, hospital nurses, physicians, everybody that might be a responder. But we also should remember that it's also citizens that need to get really upgraded in their ability to, they are really the first responders, right? So it's very important, and I think this is something that the governor might want to think about talking about, which is how do we make New York State residents themselves be more aware of what they can do to be part of the system that's going to help everybody and protect the communities. And the third element, so it's things, it's people, it's the systems themselves, the leadership, the command and control. I think the systems that were available in the 70s, 80s, and 90s actually don't work anymore for what we're going to be seeing going forward now. We're going to be seeing big disasters, weather-related, natural disasters, seismic events, and unfortunately, potentially big terrorism. But all of this is going to require maybe a different paradigm for how we structure leadership and command and control. Questions about who's in charge, who is responsible. We have a plethora of local agencies and local, state, and federal government entities, but we need clarity. I think that that the governor has to know exactly who's in charge of what aspects, how that's going to play out. That can't happen ad hoc afterwards. It has to happen as part of the planning process. So the kinds of things that could be set in motion is the pre-position in stockpiling, to making sure we have the training programs and exercises absolutely in place, and that we immediately begin to clarify some of these command and control issues that I think can be done without really spending money, but are things that will be essential to the most effective responses possible later.
Let me just supplement that a little bit. Every emergency is local. It happens on the ground in a particular community. That's where these emergencies occur, and that's where we have to attack. And therefore, I would wholeheartedly agree with the idea of an immediate program to train local governments and local responders. They are key to making sure that things happen where it happens. So I think the point I had on the chart, which is that all local emergency personnel should receive uniform training. The state ought to establish a standard of training, either at SUNY or CUNY or wherever, that train the people who are on the spot, not just the volunteers, but the people in the local communities. The mayors, the trustees, et cetera, they are the ones who are going to be there in charge of, this is a home rule state, and they are in charge of what they're doing, so we've got to get them trained. And then I do want to emphasize what Erwin and I have been saying from the very beginning, responsibility. There's a strong governor and a strong state government. We've got to have some place where somebody's going to make all this happen. We have many layers of government, many state agencies. We've got the local, regional, state, federal. All of this is going to be brought to bear on what we're doing, and I guess what we're calling for is unification someplace where we know somebody's going to be making it all happen, because there's a lot to happen, Governor. A huge amount of things have to happen. Even to train locals is a big job. So somebody somewhere has got to be in charge of that, plus all the other recommendations that we're making. And we have a plethora of recommendations.
Commissioner, another way to look at this is what can be done without any legislative authority or rulemaking in terms of just policy decisions. So if you look at how you want the National Guard trained, how to bring the private sector in, and some of these issues about stockpiling, you might want to triage this by what can be done by a policy decision, what has to have resourcing, where you need to look at regulatory issues like building codes, and then where you're actually going to have to seek new legal authorities. That kind of gives you a timeline of what you can do right away.
We always prefer things that we can do without legislation. Technically, we say getting legislation is a pain in the neck here, Mr. Allen. Ken Adams?
Thank you, Governor. I have a question for Admiral Allen. You know, because Empire State Development, the agency I run, works with private sector firms, private industry in all imaginable sectors and all across the state, I'd like to think we could be helpful as you form this private sector emergency response task force. Could you talk a little more about the types of companies, private sector firms that you want to engage in that task force? You know, where they come from, what types of firms they might be?
Yeah, I think a very easy way to look at it is the what and the how. If you start with the what, it's the type of material, generators, commodities, and things like that. The how is storage, transportation, distribution, and tracking. And if you look at the types of entities that are in the private sector that deal in those two areas, I think you have the right mix, and I think you do need a balance. One is going to be actually coming up with the materials and the supplies itself, and the other one is actually moving them. And I think that would be a good cue, and I think you have some very, very strong leaders in industry out there. I won't promote one over the other at this point, but you have very large retail operations and chain stores, but you also, and they've involved in both logistics and the material and the commodities side. But I'd start with the what and the how, and I'd have a balance between those two.
Anything else? Lieutenant Governor, you want to make any points on this topic?
A couple things. I think the recommendations I thought were terrific, especially the community response capabilities. I think that might be done in other parts of the state and could be energized for something like this. And I think the regional council concept, which the governor's created also, is a built-in infrastructure where you have business, you have community leaders, elected officials, all there at the table. Not that you duplicate that specifically, but I think you have a built-in infrastructure that really could hopefully enhance this.
Okay. I want to thank you very much. As we said, this was the preliminary report. There's more work to do, and this will be on a continuing basis. Even the training, when you start to think about that, I think we need to think about levels of training. There are certain personnel who we pay for in the state, local governments, and they're primarily responsible for the emergency response. That may be one level of training. Ira, your point about local elected officials, trustees, mayors should be trained. They may not need the same intensive level of training as an emergency responder, but they should have a level. And then, Dr. Redlener, your point about training citizens, every citizen as the first responder, that is so true. And knowing what you should do, what you shouldn't do, where you should go, when do you leave the house, when do you not leave the house? How do we educate the citizenry at large in the state is a third challenge. But anyway, plenty for us to do here. We've taken a lot of time looking at what other states do and try to educate ourselves from other states, but I think this is in many ways an evolving area for all of us. Even for the federal government as well. So maybe we can come up with some models that actually can help other people. But I want to thank you very much for the time. I look forward to working with you going forward. Any questions for our guests on this topic? Any other topic? Betty?
One of the things I'd like to ask about is transportation. I had friends in Long Beach and Lido Beach who were evacuated, and I was sending care packages. You could not use the U.S. mail because they would not deliver packages. To this day, they are still not accepting packages. They are accepting only flat mail, letters and so on. And so you have to use UPS, which was very costly, number one. But number two, their power, they still don't have phone power. They still, Verizon says that they're going to take out all of the coil lines and put in fiber optic, which is fine. But meanwhile, these people still don't have power 60 days later for telephones.
You know, Betty, what I was trying to say in the opening comments, it's shocking how quickly chaos sets in, you know, in a situation like this. Well, you'll deliver something, except the roads are flooded and the roads are blocked, so nobody can deliver anything. Well, we'll call them on the telephone, except the power is down, so the telephone's not working. Well, we'll send them an email, you know. No, because the power's down. All these systems just collapse, and one falls on top of the other and collapses that one. So it all deconstructs very quickly. Long Beach was one of the hardest areas hit on Long Island. You know, the focus tended to be New York City. I think proportionately there was more damage on Long Island, Nassau in particular, than in New York City. And many of the, as you heard in the opening comments by Commissioner Howard, many of the homes and many of the people are still suffering from the damages of the storm, which is one of the reasons we want to accelerate the response and the supplemental appropriation from the federal government to help do that. But there's no doubt that many people are still feeling the effects of the storm.
The response from the firemen and the policemen were wonderful as far as trying to evacuate these people and also to bring them water. But that was the extent of what they could do.
That's exactly right.
After Hurricane Irene, I recall we started pre-positioning supplies. I think there were 8 strategic locations around the state. This report seems to recommend that we rethink that process further. What has changed in the course of the year?
It's consistent, Jimmy. It's calling for a state stockpile and regional stockpiles. But if anything, increasing our stockpiles. Literally, we were looking for thousands and thousands of generators in the middle of the storm. Now, I don't know if that's the type of equipment that you would stockpile, but it's if you didn't prepare before and you don't have it stockpiled, it's very hard to find in the middle of one of these crisis situations. So this report is saying increase the state stockpile. It also speaks to establishing regional stockpiles, which we did establish after the last storm.
And one of the other recommendations was that gas stations, quote, in locations that might be vulnerable to a disaster, have these generators. How do you define that?
Please.
So the idea is to look at areas of vulnerability, and this is going to be a key factor for many of the recommendations that we're making, so that everything from building codes to where gas stations, to gas station locations that might be in harm's way during a predictable disaster like a coastal storm, to make sure that priority is given to those particular fuel stations to have very specific kinds of capability of backup generator power, so that assuming they have the fuel, they'll be able to pump that fuel. This is what it comes down to. And then the second thing to look at is evacuation routes. So if we're looking at areas of vulnerability along the coast, and we also understand where the evacuation routes might be, it's important that there's strategic placement of significant backup electricity generation in stations that are along the evacuation routes. This requires a great deal of planning and thoughtfulness about it, and we never know exactly what the disaster is going to bring, but I think for many types of situations we can have a good general idea of where this backup emphasis needs to be.
Governor, do you embrace that? Do you think that there have been bills proposed by legislators that some gas stations should be required to have these backup generators? Do you embrace that?
We will have some form of it, Jimmy, in the state. Talk about systems that just collapse upon you, that you take for granted. The fuel delivery system. The fuel delivery was disrupted by about a day and a half or 2 days because of the storm. The Coast Guard had closed the harbor, tankers couldn't come in, the pumping station didn't have power, so it couldn't pump, but it was about a couple of days break in the supply. It caused 2-3 weeks of havoc. That short a break in the supply. Went to rationing, et cetera, but it cost us untold millions of dollars in the effect on the economy. What happened? Everything happened. Started with the Coast Guard in the harbor, but then it was loss of power at the pumping stations, and then it was gasoline stations that had gasoline in the tanks, but the pumps wouldn't work because they didn't have power, and they didn't have a backup generator. Well, backup generators are expensive for gasoline stations to put in. I understand that, but I also understand that you need that capacity in quote-unquote vital areas, evacuation routes. I understand the impact on asking the private sector to have this capacity, but I also understand the necessity of it. So we'll weigh that, and we'll have a specific proposal in the state of the state. Other states do it, by the way. There are other states that mandate backup generators in certain stations in certain parts of the state.
Governor, more power needs to be vested in the governor's office. Did you have any frustrations, they mentioned in the report, for example, implementing curfews, gas rationing? Do you feel as though, and does that need to be done legislatively to give the governor's office more authority to act on a statewide basis?
We'll look at the laws, Zach. I don't know that this is really a legal function at this time. We had a lot of frustrations, but they're more operational frustrations. I enjoyed good relationships with the local officials. The Mayor Bloomberg and I worked very well and closely together. County Executive Ed Mangano, County Executive Steve Ballone in Suffolk County. We worked cooperatively. Things like the gas rationing plan was put in cooperatively. So Nassau, Suffolk, and New York City all put in the same plan at the same time. Now, was it essential that we had that coordination? Yes. New York City puts in a gas rationing plan on its own. It creates mayhem in the neighboring counties. You can't get gas in New York City. You deluge Queens and you deluge Westchester. Nassau puts in a plan on its own. You deluge Suffolk and you deluge New York City. So the ability to coordinate is essential. But many frustrations, but they were more operational. We'll look at the legal authority as part of this exercise. But the frustration was more operational from my point of view because I enjoyed good relationships with those local officials and we did work cooperatively.
Governor, the report also recommends a strategic fuel reserve for the state. Is that something you see as doable? Is there any estimate how much that would cost?
If it's feasible, Glenn, you know, it is, how much does it cost? Where would it be? Could you get it down? But as I said, on fuel, we learned this lesson the hard way. We couldn't get it here, and then it was almost impossible to get it from neighboring states. I actually asked the president to waive certain federal requirements because you can't just send a tanker from here to Massachusetts to pick up gasoline and come back. There was all sorts of state requirements and federal requirements. So, and we saw the effect on the economy, the chaos that it brings when you don't have fuel. So, yes, I'm open to it. I want to understand the feasibility. And as always, in this building, it's about the cost, which is obviously a factor. And we consume a tremendous amount of gasoline. I mean, it is millions of gallons per day. So to have a meaningful reserve, you know, you're not talking about a couple of gasoline cans in the garage here. This is a really significant undertaking. Mike?
With respect to, why is this being done now? Why wasn't it done before, since there's a 1978 law that requires the State Disaster Commission to meet at least twice a year? You had state reports that warned of Sandy-like events coming up. You had the experience yourself of Irene and Lee and from HUD.
I think, Mike, what they'll say is, oh, no, we did it. We did it. You know, this has been an evolutionary process, and there's been more preparedness and more readiness and more sophistication in this field, and it's been growing continuously. You look at where this was 10 years ago. It was a much less sophisticated operation on both the state level and the local level. I think what's happening is climate change is dramatically increasing the frequency and the severity of these situations. And as time goes on, we're more and more realizing that these crises are more frequent and worse than anyone had predicted.
Well, they were predicted, though, in those reports that were ignored. And again, for the last 2 years, you've had the experience of Irene and Lee and your HUD experience. Why weren't some things like, as you mentioned during the crisis, the fuel line was a complete surprise and incredibly chaotic. That law was requiring a commission to meet like this every 2 years, every year, to consider exactly these kinds of issues. Why hasn't that happened?
Well, Mike, I don't know that they predicted. You know, people predict a lot of things. You have predictions and then you have probability. And many of these types of initiatives are very, very expensive. Like even take the fuel, strategic fuel supply. Well, the state should store 30 millions of gasoline regionally. Well, okay, you know, but it's how much, where. So there's a feasibility that goes along with all of these initiatives. And you have to weigh it against the probability and against the cost. You know, you can be prepared for a lot of things, but the question is how much do you want to pay and what is the probability that those things are going to occur? And money is important, and money is a factor in all of these decisions. And after Irene, by the way, Mike, we did make, look, over the past 2 years, we have brought tremendous reforms and sophistication to this area. I mean, Jerry Hauer, as I said when I appointed Jerry Hauer, he was the best in the country. And I was looking for the best in the country because I knew how important this function was. As I said to you, you can't be out there in the middle of a situation like this and not feel it throughout your entire body and not revisit it when you put your head on the pillow for months to come. And I take this responsibility, you know, very seriously. If you ask me, you know, what is the nightmare as governor, being in a situation where you have the people in your state in the middle of an emergency and the state doesn't have the capacity to be of service. That's a nightmare. So we are aware of it. We've made tremendous progress. I think this effort is going to bring us to a level that probably doesn't exist in the country, and I'd be proud of that.
Did the commission look, by the way, at the cost of some of these separate items, especially the intense ones such as centralized training, community, fuel reserve? Do you have any cost estimates on any of the recommendations?
What the commissions did was we brought together what I would call subject matter experts, and we established panels to look at the most pressing problems and create an agenda that we would recommend to the governor on how to move forward. This is going to be an iterative process. The first phase was to bring people that have had a great experience in these areas into the same room or in the same meetings and lay out an agenda, the way forward, focusing on those most critical aspects that are basically not in contention. The policy decisions related to whether or not there is rulemaking, statutory or policy decisions to be made in resourcing are more properly with the state government and with the governor. Our job was to recommend those best solutions that the subject matter experts that were paneled could come up with on behalf of the governor.
Well, Yancey, we haven't done any financial analysis, but it's going to be very, very expensive. Two verys in there. Look, you're talking about training. First, you have to develop a curriculum that doesn't exist now. And then you're talking about training thousands of people from across the state in a highly specialized area. So it's going to be very, very expensive. Now, discussion with Mike, I believe it's essential and I believe it's important, and you make choices. And I am willing to invest money in this area. It has to be within the financial bounds that we're dealing, but this is one of the areas that I'm going to propose activity and investment.
And related to that, just for training, is there a timeline? I don't know if you went this far in thinking, but how long did it take to complete training, get it running? I think back to like TSA after 9/11, it took a long time to actually get scanners and all of that in the airports. How long the training take?
Difficulty varies with the population. I think the easiest target to improve performance immediately is with the National Guard. They're organized, they have a training system. It's a matter of prioritizing and focusing what they do. Taking the general population and moving them into a higher degree of competency in relation to response and understanding what emergency procedures are is it's going to be more time consuming. But again, it gets back to my previous comment. I think you need to kind of triage these and what's the art of the possible. Do you need legislation or regulatory action to do it? What are the resource issues that are involved, and move more quickly on those that you can do right now? And I think the recommendation on the National Guard probably is the easiest to implement at this time.
Utilities, you were critical of them during the storm. Is there any additional steps you're going to take to try to put more regulations in to increase their response to outages?
Joe, we have 4 commissions, just sort of 4 focus areas. We're talking now about 2 of them, the Ready and the Respond. The Commission 2100 is a longer-term infrastructure look at the issue. That hasn't reported back. It will shortly. And the Moreland Commission looks exactly at that question, and they'll report back shortly also. All before the state of the state. We'll then review all the recommendations. We'll take the ones that are financially feasible and the short-term ones, and we'll include them in the state of the state.
Governor, the House Speaker announced yesterday that there will be a vote after all on January 15th. For some of the federal aid for Sandy. Friday, there will also be a vote for flood insurance.
So he wants me to take back everything I said?
Well, first, just your response to that development, and also once that aid, if it is approved, how will that help enact some of the proposals that you're discussing here today?
Look, I've had many conversations with the Speaker, with the Majority Leader, with all sorts of congressional members, late into the night, day after day, for weeks now. You're saying what the Speaker said. I'm at the point where it's simple for me. Show me the money, because I've heard a lot of things. And until I see the cash, I'm going to reserve judgment, because many of the things that have been said never happened. So now they say, well, the vote was going to happen in about 2 weeks. I was told the vote was going to happen in 20 minutes, and it didn't happen. So I'll wait for the actual results before I comment. The money is essential, though, because the funding is less about the state's budget. It's more to tell individual homeowners what they can expect and individual business owners what they can expect and what programs are available and how much we can provide those homeowners and business owners, and therefore what they can do. Should they stay in their house? Can they fix their house? Will they be eligible for enough of a grant to do those renovations or not? And people just don't know. And I can't tell them. You know, I have people all day long who are saying to me, you know, what do you think is going to happen? You know, I have $75,000 worth of damage. The insurance covers X. That leaves me with a gap of Y. Can the state fund it? Will FEMA fund it? I don't have an answer because I don't know. And that is cruel to do to those people. And it has been an extraordinarily long period of time. Well, government is slow. Not in this area. This is an extraordinarily long delay just by the number of days. You go back and look at past disasters and how quickly the federal government responded. And you look at this disaster and look at how slow the federal government is in responding, and it is night and day. And to inject their politics and their chaos into this situation was truly an outstanding failure on their part. And in many ways a violation of the basic oath that they took. So I'll wait to see what they do.
Governor, just to be clear, do you say the Moreland Commission will report to you before the State of the State? I mean, I know those two hearings were canceled.
Commissions will have a preliminary report to me for inclusion in the State of the State.
Are you concerned that those two hearings, there was one in the Rockaways, one in Staten Island, I mean, are they missing something by not getting testimony?
You know, it's like there's going to be more work for the commissions to do. These commissions will continue to do work. The Education Commission that we heard from yesterday continues to work until the fall. The Moreland Commission will go on. But the State of the, I didn't want to lose the whole year. And the State of the State is my time to put forth my agenda. And I asked the commissions to bifurcate their work, get me the short-term, larger scale, bigger ideas, if you will, for inclusion in the State of the State. The commissions then can continue. We can still enact findings, but to the extent I have the most fully informed, complete State of the State, that's what I wanted to do.
Governor, I asked you yesterday if you were going to sign the Daily News' petition calling for a ban on assault weapons. You said you hadn't seen it, but you did say you did support that was your position. I was wondering if you had a chance to look at the Daily News petition and if you intended...
No, I didn't, Glenn. I meant to. I had it on my to-do list. I did not get to it.
But if that's your position, why not sign it?
Well, let me see what the petition says. Maybe I'll put forth my proposal and you'll sign my petition.
Governor, you talked about some of these measures needing support from the legislature. On these issues and others, do you see instances where now with the Senate being so split between Democrats and Republicans, where you would try to reach out to Senate Democrats and try to build support among Senate Democrats and get something passed through that House?
Joe, I reach out to everyone. That's my theory of legislative relations, you know. I reach out to everyone, majority, the minority, anyone who will work with me, I will work with them. And whatever the configuration is, you know, they pick the configuration and I respond to their configuration. Dealing with the legislature for an executive is a difficult process. Almost by design, it's a difficult process. The legislative process is difficult. You look at what's going on in Washington, you can see what happens when it really derails and becomes dysfunctional. What happened with the fiscal cliff, et cetera, what happened to us with this Sandy aid. It was disingenuous and dysfunctional. This state legislature has been that way before. Past 2 years, it's worked better. I hope it continues to work better this year. But my strategy is going to be exactly what my strategy was. I will reach out to all of them, and more than that, I will communicate to the people of the state. which is when people say, well, what was different over the past 2 years in Albany? Why did Albany work better? It's not that the personalities changed in Albany. Legislature that existed over the past 2 years was basically the same legislature that existed for years. I think communicating with the people, where the politicians then hear from the people, I think that works. Time-consuming, exhausting, makes the cabinet very tired because they have to run all over the state. But it's also very effective. It's also almost undeniable. If you have the people of the state with you, the politicians will follow, or the politicians will not be reelected. That's the primary operating philosophy of the system. So I use and energize that primary operating system. So I am going to reach out to the IDC. I'm going to be seeing them over the next few days or right around the state of the state. I'll be talking to them, going through my agenda, asking for their support. I'll speak with the Senate Republicans. I met with the Senate minority last week. We had a good meeting. We'll have another meeting. And I'll work with all of them. But as I've said to you before, I don't pass my legislative agenda in this building. I pass it by doing all those town halls all around the state, by the emails, by the internet, by the videos, by the cabinet being at town halls all across the state. That's how I pass the legislative agenda. They hear about it when they go home. It's the tug on the sleeve in the supermarket where they say, well, what is the governor talking about, raising the minimum wage? I think you should do that. That's how you convince a politician.
Governor, speaking of the state of the state, you've talked a lot about, possibly passing gun control legislation, campaign finance reform via independent expenditures, minimum wage. Is there anything next week that you'll be mentioning that hasn't been discussed before? And feel free to be as specific as possible.
Let me think about that question for a while. Yes, there will be other things that will be mentioned. I think you will see a very robust state of the state. Look, Nick, if you just look at the issues that we've talked about already, right? You look at the education agenda yesterday. You look at the agenda that we spoke about today. You look at the challenges that we have been presented, right? A big role of government is you respond to the need at the time. What should a governor do? A governor should do what the people of the state need done at that time. So it's not that you come with a preordained agenda. You do in part, but also you have to respond to the need at the time. This state has tremendous needs that are being presented at this time. The issue of gun violence, the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. These are just issues of the day that have been presented to you that government needs to respond to, plus everything else that you've been doing, plus the upstate economy, plus ending inequality, plus raising the minimum wage. So it's going to be a very robust agenda. Anything else? Thank you very much.